It's one of the reasons I'm here. Matt Logan, who's the executive director of the Montgomery County Historical Society, is here, and part of the partnership here is I've now, over the last few years, joined the Speakers Bureau at Montgomery Historical Society and speak around the county. And on this topic of mine that is a favorite topic of immigration and the changing face of the county. And one of the reasons why I have become so interested in this subject is because this is really part of my family history too. Lily mentioned that she's been in America for 28 years. My family came from Russia about 100 years ago, but I grew up in a town in New Jersey that was very heavily ethnic, very heavily immigrant. I was fortunate enough to have 3 living grandparents, one in the house with me, one 3 blocks away. My 2 grandparents, and my real family name is Rogowski. It's not Roberts at all. I find this false flag. My dad changed the name when I was 2. In fact, I grew up, and I never had a babysitter I wasn't related to. I mean, it was this very close-knit immigrant family, heavily Catholic. It was about 80% Catholic and about 19% Jewish, which is what we were. I used to kid that I grew up thinking Protestants were a tiny minority group, some weird sect. And I get to Harvard, right, and I see all these names on the buildings. Kirkland, Eliot. They were so short. And they ended in consonants. I mean, I always thought I was on Mars. The first day I was at Harvard, I met a guy named, he became quite a famous figure in the Bush White House. He was chief counsel to President Bush 41, named C. Boyden Gray. Gray, I had literally had never met anybody with a name that short, and using his first initial. We didn't do that in Bayonne. What? C. Vinnie Nuccio? M. Paulie Pawlowski? It was not our style, I can tell you that. So I've had a lifelong interest in immigration and ethnicity as a result of my family's background, as well as the fact that in my long years as a New York Times correspondent, I always sought out ethnic stories, always went to immigrant communities. I was a correspondent in California for 5 years, from 69, 74. All my colleagues were writing about Hollywood and surfers, and I went 50 miles inland to the Central Valley, where all of these farming communities were very ethnic based. The biggest building in Kerman, California was the Portuguese American home. Part of what happened in it's less familiar here in the eastern patterns of immigration, but in the West, many of the families who immigrated went to these microclimates that resembled the climates back home because they knew how to grow the crops and raise the livestock in certain climates and certain areas. So California had all these microclimates. So there were all these Portuguese who knew how to grow a certain kind of melon, which was perfect in those 10 miles around Kerman, California. You had colonies of Swiss dairy farmers. You had colonies of Italian wine growers, the famous Gallo and other families, the Italians, but they weren't the only ones. There were actually 3 cultures that grew wine in California: the Italians, the Yugoslavs, and they were and the Croatians, and they had this terrible problem. Cesar Chavez, the great labor organizer in California, told me once, you know, I have to have 3 separate negotiations with these 3 different ethnic groups because they don't talk to each other, even though they all grew wine in California. So this has very much been a part of my life as a writer. And as I've settled in Montgomery County, I raised my hand when I said I was not born in Montgomery County, when Lily asked, but I have lived here 40 years. In fact, my wife Koki and I live in the house she grew up in on Bradley Boulevard. It's still there. And for Montgomery County, this is a long time. We are not exactly transients. This house has been in her family for 65 years. We've lived in there for 40, but just this fall, we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary on the exact same spot in the yard of this house we now live in. We got married on that same spot and had our wedding anniversary 50 years later on the exact same spot last September. So while we are not, by your definition, natives, we probably are on the more stable side of this transient world of Montgomery County. And as I've lived here for many years, in addition to my connection with the Montgomery County Historical Society, my friend Steve Hull, who edits Bethesda Magazine, asked me some years ago to start writing a column about Bethesda and Montgomery County. And the more I got into it, the more I felt that this changing nature of the county that Lily so eloquently spoke about was a central part of our life here, and one that I hoped people would understand and appreciate and relish and applaud. I come at this story, I'm very open about this. I am very pro-immigration. But I based it on my own experience. I based it on the statistics and the research I've done. Sure, there are some downsides. Lily mentioned one of them, the schools. The schools can be overburdened. When you have, Montgomery County College, a wonderful institution, has 170 languages in foreign countries. There's a price you pay for that, right? We know that in the public schools and in the colleges, but there's the benefits so far outweigh the costs. The benefits of vitality, the benefits of entrepreneurship, the benefits of a diverse and an exciting culture that we're all part of here. And I've had the chance to meet some of these immigrants. I'll tell you a couple of stories just to put some faces on the wonderful statistics. I sat there scribbling. I got ideas for at least 3 more columns in Bethesda Magazine from Lily's wonderful presentation. Highway to Heaven is one of them, I'll tell you that. In fact, at Bethesda, we've just had a big conference, and over the next couple of years, we're going to devote a significant percentage of the magazine, every issue, hopefully, including a major story on immigration and ethnicity. This is one of our long-range projects at the magazine, because what you were talking about is so important and so relevant to the life of the community. But I got to fill in a couple of blanks in Lily Chi's story. Yes, you heard that she was from Shanghai, and she and Phil immigrated. I did write a column about them a few years ago, and a lot of what I first started learning about the ethnic makeup of Montgomery County, particularly the Asian community, came from Lily over many talks. She's educated me, or she's educated you this morning, but she left out some key elements in her own story. For instance, she pointed out to me that when the Chinese community started flooding into Montgomery County, the word was that you looked for a school district where the high school began with a W. Walt Whitman, Walter Johnson, Wooten, and Winston Churchill. And that was the first thing that they learned when they started looking for a school district. Obviously, there are many other fine high schools in Montgomery County besides those 4, but that was the focal point. And in fact, I'm quoting Lily here, so that there are so many, the Wooten High has become so heavily Chinese that the nickname among the school kids is it's Wonton High. I see you nodding, right? You went to Wonton High too?
I went to Walter Johnson.
Went to Johnson, same thing. Yeah. And Lily told me this wonderful story about this, she mentioned, Gaithersburg becoming, and Rockville becoming really Chinatown, and she talked in trying to illustrate what had happened is this enormous ethnic flow here, that when she and Phil first moved to Montgomery County, when she was trying to find Chinese vegetables, Asian vegetables, the only place you could find them was a Korean grocery store. Of course, the Koreans, the first thing they do when they arrive somewhere is build a grocery store. And so there was those outposts. But as the Chinese community grew, of course, entrepreneurship and economy meets demand, they created a grocery store right there on Hungerford. And of course, I teach at George Washington University, known as GW. So she said to me, well, the name of the grocery is the GW. I said, really? George Washington said, no, Great Wall. And that was the name of the grocery. And she told me about how going in there, and you talk about this wonderful diversity of this county, she said, but of course, the Chinese kids were not working behind a counter because they were taking, the violin lessons and the martial arts lessons that she was talking about, right? So who works behind the counter in the GW? The Hispanic kids. And so she told me about how she deals at the GW with all of these wonderful kids who are making extra money after school as salespeople, and these Hispanic kids have had to learn Chinese to deal with their Chinese customers. So this is a wonderful snapshot of the diversity and the vitality that immigrants bring to Montgomery County, with the Chinese customers talking Chinese to these Hispanic kids who were selling them Yeah, she said, behind the meat counter, just the other day I had this wonderful conversation with a young Hispanic and Chinese about what cut of meat I should buy. So Lily and Phil have lived this story and have helped educate me about it and helped encourage me to find some other stories. And one of my favorite stories is Lily mentioned that the single largest country of origin for these immigrants is El Salvador. And this is a woman from El Salvador, and I describe Rosa Linares as Montgomery County's smallest entrepreneur. Rosa came here as an immigrant and totally unschooled and unskilled, but made her way, as so many immigrants do, and cleaning houses. That's how she supported herself, supported her family. And she made enough money to buy a little house in the community of Adelphi, right on the PG Montgomery border. And her sons, there was an empty lot next to the house, this little house that she bought. So her sons, who had prospered in America, bought her the empty lot next to her house. And she immediately started a farm. Now, it wasn't just any farm. This woman was is a truly brilliant entrepreneur, because she figured out that there were all of these immigrant families from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala in particular, who missed so many things about home. And one of the most elemental dimensions of cultural identity is food and aromas. And she figured out that all of these young housewives from El Salvador and Guatemala wanted their kitchens to smell the way their mother's kitchen smelled back home. So she created a farm growing all of the vegetables and herbs and produce that were native to the Salvadoran and Guatemalan kitchens. So she arrives one day at the Crossroads Market, which is a wonderful market in Tacoma Park that's specifically aimed at immigrant families. And she announces to the people who run the market, well, I'm going to sell my produce here. And they said, well, do you have a permit? Do you have a stand? She said, no, this is where I should be. And she sets up this little stand. I mean, it's no bigger than this table. And she's got her chipolline and her other spices and vegetables and little in buckets. I mean, her overhead is like $1.99. I mean, it is as close to zero as you can get for an entrepreneur, right? And I'm there one morning to write a column about the market. And the market opens at 11, and at 10 o'clock, 10:15, I see this long line of young moms, many of them clearly Hispanic, with dozens of little kids running around. In fact, the market has had they have a clown to entertain the kids and a musician, because it's become such a feature of the market's life. So I say to the young woman, Christy Balch, well, what is that story? She says, that's Rosa Linares. That she is the most popular vendor in this entire market, and all of those young moms are there to buy her products so they can duplicate the recipes and the tastes and the aromas of home. And for all of the vitality and for all of the energy that immigrants bring, there are costs to immigration. There always have been. There always have been. And being separated from your basic culture to be able to recreate at least this element of it was such a gift and such a brilliant economic innovation. And so she's the most popular figure in the market. So I went up to her, and I don't speak Spanish, and she speaks virtually no English. And I didn't have the help of a translator at the point, so I went up to her, and I said, Rosa, do you do all the work on your farm yourself? And she just grinned at me with these gold-plated teeth and held out her fingers. And they were so scarred and beaten up and cracks lined with dirt. She didn't have to say a word. Basically saying, are you kidding me? You privileged white guy, this is what I do, right? Just read my hands. That's all you need to know about who I am and what my life is like. And I love this story because in the small, Lily was so right about all of these elevated companies and the highest tech engines of growth and job creation in Montgomery County are so important, but so are the Rosa Lenarses. From the most ground level single entrepreneur, every day each one of these people contributes something so vital and so valuable to the economic and the cultural diversity of the county. Another young woman that I met who I really admire is a woman named Karina Velasco. Now, she is a product of Montgomery College. And she came here as a undocumented young woman. She was really a child. She was about 10 or 12. Her parents were undocumented. They had come before her. They are from Mexico. And she was raised by her grandmother back home when her parents came here for economic opportunities. And she comes here, and she was telling me how about sort of the emotional side of being a young immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, with undocumented parents. Now, I know that Montgomery College does not ask, and should not ask, who's undocumented, but we know that a significant percentage, student body at Montgomery College is undocumented, as it's true for many of the high schools in Montgomery County. And she talked so feelingly about what it was like to come home from school every day and not know whether your parents were going to be there, because they were subject to arrest and seizure and deportation, and what that meant to the mental health of these young people. She said, I grew up with nightmares, screaming at night, you know, where's my mother? Where's my father? They've been taken away. And her mother was very rigorous. And she said to her, as this kid got a little older, said to her, look, you are not going to be one of those kids who gets pregnant at 14 and drops out of school. You're going to be here in America. You are going to work, and you're going to stay in school. And she said, one of the ways I'm going to keep you in school, her mother's job was not cleaning houses. She cleaned office buildings downtown. That's what her mother did. And she went to work like at 10 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night after the offices closed, worked till early in the morning cleaning the office building. And she said to Karina, you are coming with me. You're going to work with me, and I'm going to keep you out of trouble. And so this kid would finish high school, and at 8 o'clock at night, go downtown and work for 6 hours or 8 hours cleaning office buildings with her mom. She was totally exhausted, but she stayed out of trouble. And she gets to Montgomery College. And Montgomery College was her gateway to the future. And there she discovered an interest and a talent for social work. And so she went through Montgomery College, went on to University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and today is a licensed social worker specializing in the emotional problems of young immigrants. Now think about, again, what a wonderful contribution this young woman is making to her community every single day. And Montgomery College was really the bridge to her future. She got her started. This was a kid, as I say, who was cleaning houses all through high school, cleaning houses from 8 o'clock at night to 3 o'clock in the morning. He didn't have a lot of time to study. Wasn't really ready financially or academically for a full-dress 4-year college. Montgomery College gave her that boost, gave her that bridge to her future. Now, she is protected from deportation right now under the program that President Obama started. It was called DACA, Delayed Action on Childhood Arrivals. She qualified for that program. There were about 700,000 or 800,000 young people nationwide who, under this program initiated by Obama, that they were protected from deportation. They were allowed to get driver's license, work permits. This is one of the programs that is very much in jeopardy under the new administration. And like Lily, I'm not here to give a political speech. But this is actually one area. These young people are sometimes called the dreamers, people who have never known. Karina came here kind of late. I mean, she was 10. A lot of these kids were much younger when they came to America. And so far, President Trump has indicated a certain understanding how valuable this program is. So people like Karina are protected, but she's still very nervous, and because what happened is, of course, in order to qualify for this program, they had to hand over all of this information to the federal government about who they were and where they lived and what their status was. In the hands of someone who wanted to crack down on illegal immigrants, they could be very vulnerable if that information got into the hands of immigration authorities with a different and more aggressive program and priority list about. So the program was kind of stalled because no one is really signing up again because of the fears about what's happened, but it's been an absolutely essential, valuable program for Karina and many of young people in Montgomery County in a similar situation. And she's just a wonderful example of the contributions that these kids are making every day and how important Montgomery College is in terms of giving them that bridge to their future. A third person I met, in fact, this was largely as a result of conversations with Lily, who helped me try to understand that the Hispanic experience, very important, very valuable, did not stand for the whole experience, that the Asian experience was very different, partly because people were so much better educated. Phil and Lily came here for graduate school, if I remember correctly. And that is very much the story of Chinese and Indian communities. A high percentage of the people who come here for graduate school. And they are deeply connected to the high-tech industries here in Montgomery County. And so I wanted, at one point, to do a column about a family that had just become American citizens. I read a story about President Obama speaking to a naturalization ceremony. And I thought, gee, does any of them live in Montgomery County? I'd love to find one. And the Immigration Service was actually quite helpful and identified 6 or 7. And the fellow that I wound up writing my column about is a man named Charlie Sun. Charlie, like Phil and Lily, a native of China, came originally to America to get a graduate degree in biology at UCLA in California. His interest in biology, interestingly enough, was spawned by his mother, who was an expert in Chinese herbal medicine. And he had these childhood memories of roaming the fields with his mom as she searched for herbs. He called her a pharmacist, but she wasn't really a trained pharmacist in the Western sense. But her knowledge of herbal remedies, she worked at a hospital in China and as an expert on the administration of these herbal remedies. And so he had an interest in biology, and so he goes to UCLA, but he's a pretty smart guy and very much an entrepreneurial instinct. And about halfway through his experience at UCLA, he realized that the real growth was going to be in technology and IT. So he changed his major mid-course to computer science and eventually makes his way here, gets hired by the National Institutes of Health, and particularly the National Cancer Institute. And what Charlie Sun does, this native of China, he is the guy in charge of the software that helps the most advanced cancer researchers do their work. He's the one who creates the very advanced software that keeps track of all of their experimentation. The NCI would not be at the forefront of cancer research without people like Charlie Sun. They're absolutely central to, you go from Rosalind Norris, right, the smallest entrepreneur, to the highest tech. And these are the two faces, or more than two faces, but these are that Lily described so well, that there's this enormous range of people who represent the immigrant experience in Montgomery County. And so I got to know Charlie, and I said, well, why did you become an American citizen? He said, well, it was kind of difficult. He said, I have a Chinese passport. My wife, who is an academic, she teaches business, the only job she could really get as a business school professor when we were first married was in Singapore. So she taught in Singapore for 4 months a year, so she got a Singaporean passport. And my 2 girls who go to Richmond Montgomery High School have American passports. So when we would travel, the 4 of us had 3 different passports. And he said this was really getting much too complicated. So he said, as much as anything, we got an American passport just to regularize the family. But he said, he represented something that Lily helped explain to me, that when you think about science, science is like music or athletics. You don't have to have a high degree of cultural competency to succeed. Science is science, music is music, as Phil knows, and you can bridge cultural differences in certain areas. It's like athletics as well, right? You don't have to speak English to be a high jumper, right? Or a long distance runner. But Charlie said to me, he said, two things very interestingly. One was that, I can have a very good job here and I can make a very good salary, but I can't go beyond a certain point. I can't really be an entrepreneur in the science field in America. First of all, I don't really have the cultural competency. I don't have access to capital. But back in China, I do. Because I have a lot of friends who made a lot of money in China, and they're looking for investment opportunities. So he represents sort of this bi-coastal, this global, Lily talks about the global nature of so much of particularly the high-end industry in Montgomery County. Charlie is a perfect example of it. Because there he is living here, working at NIH, but he's created a business with friends back in China to market a low-cost cancer detection kit. And he can do that there, not here, because he has the connections. He has the family connections, the language capability, access to capital that he doesn't have here. So as Lily has said to me many times, these people, a lot of these immigrants from China are very successful, but there's a ceiling in terms of entrepreneurship that they bump up against in the American culture, whereas this curious, almost perverse irony that this communist country is actually providing more entrepreneurial opportunities for some of these expat Chinese than America has. So that leads to reinforce Lily's point about how important it is for Montgomery County to tap into people like this and give them the opportunities to rise higher beyond the bench scientist salaried jobs that many of them have been very successful at. But the other thing that he taught me several other things. We were sitting in the Woodside Deli in Rockville, many of you know, and he says to me, he pulls out his phone, and he shows me his phone, and he says, there's something called WeChat. WeChat, right? WeChat. He called it WeChat. This is a worldwide communications and conversation platform in Chinese. And he said, for instance, I'm in daily touch with hundreds of expat Chinese scientists around the world. And they can be in Australia, they can be in France, they can be anywhere. And we have this message board, we have this communication system. Someone has an idea, someone publishes a paper, someone has an innovation, they put it up on WeChat, and we have this worldwide community of expat Chinese scientists, all on their phones, on WeChat. Then he says, not only that, but this is so good that we're in constant contact back home. Lily mentioned it. We were talking in the break, and Natasha and I were talking that when she left, her family left Ukraine in the 70s, they thought they were leaving everything behind. And when my family came from Russia, they never looked back. And even if they wanted to, they couldn't. The Cold War, Holocaust, there are walls across our history. My grandfathers, and they fled the Cossacks, they fled religious and economic persecution. They did not view with a warm and fuzzy feeling, the Russia they left behind. And my grandfather was out of touch with his sister in Moscow for 50 years. 50 years. Early 60s, he came in 1914. Early 60s, a distant relative, there was a thaw in Moscow, Jackson-Vanik Act, Jews were allowed to immigrate, and a relative got to Israel and wrote to my grandfather in New Jersey saying, your sister Chornya is still alive. And that enabled him to reconnect with her. In fact, they did meet several times before they both died. Compare that to Charlie's son sitting in the Woodside Deli in Rockville, who is in daily, almost minute-by-minute communication with his hometown and his family in China. And so he describes to me one day where he sees on WeChat that there's been an explosion of a factory in his hometown, and he's very alarmed for the safety of his parents. He calls them immediately. He said, "Are you all right? You all right?" They had not heard of the explosion yet. He heard about it sitting in the Woodside Deli in Rockville before his parents heard about it back in his hometown. So this communication is changing the texture and the nature of immigration. Some things don't change, right? Those Salvadoran women are going to miss their grandmother's kitchens. And that's the eternal story of immigration. Every immigrant in the history of the world has said something similar to what I've heard from every immigrant I've ever interviewed, including Lily and Phil, who said, "We're not fully home in America, but we can't go home again either. We can't go back to we're suspended." I had a book that I did, as Natasha mentioned, called From Every End of This Earth, which is a title, by the way, from Obama's first inaugural address, in which he extols the virtues of immigration from every end of this earth. I took the title from his speech. And a woman from Vietnam, who was the mother of a student of mine at GW, described this syndrome as this. She said, "We are the sacrifice generation. We're the ones who've come. We know why we're here. We're here to build new lives for our kids. But we will always be in suspension. We will always be never quite fully at home, but we can't go back home again either. And it's for our children to be fully integrated." Charlie's son, in some ways, would like to go back to China. We've got two girls who are American kids in Richmond, Montgomery. Think those kids want to go back to Beijing? No. This is also the story of modern immigration. And in some ways, it adds to the vitality. It certainly adds to the economic value and contributions that immigrants can make, because they can foster these commercial connections with their home countries. Chinese at the forefront, but it's also very true of the Indians and many others. We've always had immigrants who have kept commercial connections back home. There have always been Greek families who imported olive oil and feta cheese. But we're now talking about a much, much more highly advanced set of economic connections. There's one guy I write about in my book who's Indian, who came to America originally as a grad student in chemistry at Carnegie Mellon. And so he gets his PhD, and of course, next thing on his list is a wife. You know, so where do you go for a wife? Queens, of course. And so he found a woman who was also a Brahmin from West Bengal, and they live in Medina, Ohio, and he has two factories. He has one, he makes very, very advanced industrial plastics. And he has one factory in Ohio and one factory back in Madras in India. And his address is Cleveland, right? Or Medina. But his real habitat, his natural habitat, is probably the first-class lounge in Frankfurt Airport, because he is going back and forth so often. And that's, many people in Montgomery County increasingly are seeking out business opportunities that span their countries and span these cultures. Another thing that is so important about life in Montgomery County and the role that immigrants and newcomers play. Lily gave you these stunning statistics. I've heard somewhere between 33 and 36% foreign-born, 40% speak a language other than English at home. And that is the role that local people have played in helping to resettle a lot of these immigrants. This is particularly true of political refugees who come through a very particular program, for all of the ways in which, again, I'm not being political here, but for all the ways in which the current president has tried to limit and restrict refugees. Obama, last year there were 85,000 refugees accepted into this country. Obama raised the national quota to 110,000, which is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the millions and millions of people who are displaced all over the world. But it was something. It was some contribution, and of course, Trump has tried to cut that annual quota back to 50,000, and has made it more and more difficult for these agencies to resettle refugees. And the truth is, they are the most heavily vetted of all immigrants. They go through many times several years worth of examination. Many of them have fetched up in refugee camps run by the UN. And they have to go through enormously careful vetting processes. So what happens when they come here? And Montgomery County is a center of refugee resettlement for the whole country. There are 9 agencies, 9 private agencies. Lily mentioned something very important about the economy of the county. People see this as a binary question of you're either a private employee or a government employee. But in fact, one of the most important and vital sectors of the economy is a third world of people who work for private companies who basically are on government contracts. And it's an enormously important element of the Montgomery County economy. And a lot of federal money is not spent directly by the federal government. It's spent through subcontractors. And these refugee organizations, there are 9 of them, several of them, their national headquarters are right here in Montgomery County. One is called HIAS, which originally the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. So their national headquarters in Silver Spring. And many of these are faith-based. The Lutherans very active. World Relief is the evangelicals. And so I've been tracking down a family. This is one of the perfect expressions of how this works in Montgomery County. So this is a Muslim family from Syria. And the way it works in the State Department is every week there's a meeting of these 9 refugee resettlement. They're private agencies working under contract. And they divvy up the families who are coming that week. All right, there's this family that wants to resettle in Seattle. The Lutherans, you take them, you know. And this one family, they were Syrian Muslims. The agency that resettled them were the Lutherans. But then usually there are faith-based community organizations that do the day-to-day resettlement work, find them an apartment. The Lutherans manage their transition, but then on the ground. So you got this Muslim family from Syria, resettled by the Lutherans, but the faith organization that took over them was Temple Shalom in Silver Spring. So you got a Muslim family resettled by the Lutherans and then helped by the Jews. I mean, that's Montgomery County at its best, right? That's Montgomery County at its best. And interestingly, what happens is that when these refugee organizations, when they resettle a lot of people, and Montgomery County has taken a significant number of them, they try to locate certain communities. They don't resettle them sporadically. They try to concentrate them so that they have a sense of community connection. But they look for 2 things. They look for reasonably priced housing, decent housing, and public transportation are the 2 benchmarks they look for. And there's a community, and I believe it's actually right across the line in PG County, I've looked on the map, called Riverdale Park. And that is the center of refugee resettlement in this part of the world. And a lot of the refugees who have come through these agencies are actually settled in that community. But there are a lot in Silver Spring, there are a lot in Wheaton, in Montgomery County as well. And so I met a woman named Kate Sugarman. Now, Kate she wrote to me once after one of my columns and said, you should write about this. So I met her. She had a good story to tell. She's a physician based in Potomac. She works in a public health clinic downtown. And she, over the years, became an expert in identifying and testifying about the physical effects of torture. This is not a specialty they teach in most medical schools. But what happened was that people started noticing that she became an expert in it, and so people started sending her more and more clients. Now, this is a very important issue for people seeking asylum, because the law says you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution if you go back home. Now, if you can demonstrate to a hearing officer that you've been victim of political torture, you have a very good case to stay. So it's a very important link in this chain of refugee and asylum seekers. So Kate, as she explained it to me, she said she could go into these hearings and she couldn't say, I saw this person being beaten with a police baton. But I can tell you that the injury to his eardrum is consistent with a beating by a police baton. All those scars on his knees, that's consistent with being forced to crawl over gravel, another very common form of torture, particularly in African countries. So she's become, totally accidentally, this expert in testifying and identifying the physical effects of torture. Now, she's developed a subspecialty. Lily mentioned the Ethiopians and how they are a very significant element in the immigration patterns in Montgomery County. She's become an expert not only in Ethiopians, but in Ethiopian long-distance runners. Now, the best long-distance runners in the world are Kenyans and Ethiopians. And so as Lily says, every Ethiopian who lands in Kennedy Airport has my phone number on speed dial. And the case in Ethiopia, the political situation in Ethiopia, a little bit like Syria, where a relatively small group, ethnic religious group, has captured the government. Syria, it's the Alawites and the Assad clan. In Ethiopia, it's another group, and they have persecuted everybody else, every other tribal group. And the long-distance runners tend to be from the Oromo tribe, who are political dissidents in Ethiopia. So many of these long-distance runners not only arrive here as political refugees, but they've been fired, they've been tortured, they have congregated around Silver Spring. And so Kate has become kind of their den mother, and she's and she started organizing them into a running club. Call themselves the Black Lions. And last year, the Olympic Committee, for the first time, agreed to allow refugees to compete in the Olympics, not under a national flag, but under the Olympic flag. First time it's ever happened. So with the incentive of training for this, she organized this group. Now, these guys were world-class runners, but they were way out of training. You cannot compete at that level. You know, if you've been tortured, you've got to work. One guy said to me, I got to work 3 jobs at a parking garage just to support my family. Where are we going to have time to train for the Olympics? But Kate was a great entrepreneur. She got a gym to donate time. She got a athletic shoe company to donate shoes. She got orthopedics to treat their injuries. All of these free services. And none of the Black Lions did qualify for the Olympics, but that wasn't really the point. The point was that they had resurrected their history, and they had resurrected their sense of identity, and they had resurrected their great skill. And so the emotional benefits of, along with the political and physical benefits, were enormous. And again, this is just one example of a Montgomery County resident saying, I'm not just going to make a speech about the virtues of immigration, I'm going to help. I'm going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And the fact is, there are many people throughout our county, faith-based organizations, synagogues, churches, mosques, Hindu temples, who are part of this process and contributing every day, and individuals like Kate. And it's been a very important part of understanding Montgomery County's approach to immigration. That by and large, we welcome it. There are differences, there are problems. I don't think anybody will sugarcoat them. But this welcoming atmosphere is why people keep coming. When Lily said, why do they keep coming? Yeah, it's economic opportunity, but people have found a home here. They found a welcome here. If the welcome mat was not out, they'd find somewhere else to go. And it's important for all of us. All of us can make a contribution, each in our own little way, whether it's with a neighbor, whether it's participating through your church, whether it's teaching a class. There are countless ways in which individuals can help burnish and enhance the contributions that immigrants make every day to the vitality of our community. I'll close with one thing. It's also important to remember our history. I've recently come across a very interesting story, which is the subject of my new column in Bethesda Magazine. And people, because I now write this column, people come to me with these stories, which I love. Feel free, any of you. I never knew that there was a colony of black landowners along River Road in Bethesda. Lily and I first met, we both served on the board of the Montgomery Hospice together. Another mutual friend of ours and co-board member is the Reverend Sterling King, an African-American who ministers, he just retired, but he, for 27 years, ministered to a small church on River Road. Now, I drove past this church hundreds of times and never knew it was there. It's a Macedonian Baptist church. One day I'm sitting at the Montgomery Hospice board meeting and talking to Reverend King, and he says, you know, the reason why that's there is because there used to be this very vibrant and vital community of African Americans who were landowners. They weren't tenant farmers, they were landowners who owned land on both sides of River Road, starting at Little Falls Parkway out to Kenwood. And so I started looking into this community. Now, it's gotten some attention lately because there's a controversy over a cemetery, an old African-American cemetery that's in the path of development on West Bard there. But I got interested in the community that lived there. It turns out that this community was started by freed slaves. Going back to the post-Civil War period, people have no idea. While Maryland was a free state, it was a part of the Union, it was a slaveholding state. And people need to remember that that is also part of our history. And many of the farms and plantations in these very wealthy suburbs at one time were farms and plantations that were slaveholding institutions. And one of the most prominent was right there, if you go down Little Falls Parkway between River Road and Massachusetts Avenue, up on a hill. The plantation house is still there. It's called Milton. It's up on a hill, and it was the Loughborough Plantation. And the economics of this was on River Road. On Little Falls, there's a new development there, but that was a granite quarry. And quarrying was a big industry in that part of Montgomery County. A lot of the black families found work in the quarries. The women found work in the burgeoning settlement of Kenwood. They were cooks and maids. And these people were stable and landowning families. And there were about 30 to 35 families. And if you drive up in that period, you can look at these tiny streets. One is called Clipper, one is called Dorsey, and these were named for the original black families who lived there. Late 50s, early 60s, entrepreneurs came in, developers came in. We all welcome economic development. There's a downside to it, Lily. And the downside here was a lot of the black families were pushed out. In fact, virtually all of them were pushed out. By the early 60s, there wasn't a black family left, a landowning black family left on River Road. And I met one of the men who's been quite vocal and active in the preservation movement of the cemetery, a man named Harvey Matthews, wonderful man, now in his 70s. Harvey grew up, if any of you can picture River Road, where the Whole Foods market is and that whole economic development. His farm, he grew up on a family farm where Whole Foods market is now. And his father was a specialist in raising hunting dogs. People would come from all over the metropolitan area, farm out their dogs for 6 or 8 weeks while Harvey's father trained them. And his father was a big hunter. He would trap muskrats in Little Falls Creek and sell the hides. And his favorite, and raccoons was another favorite target of his hunting. And his favorite hunting ground was were the two areas where Walter Johnson and Walt Whitman high schools now are. They were open fields, and that's where he hunted raccoons and sold the pelts. There was a broker out in Sandy Spring he would sell the pelts to. And Harvey said to me, you know, it's lily white Bethesda now, and people don't remember, don't know. He said, we were the lost colony of Bethesda. So as we welcome the future, as we welcome the diversity that foreign-born immigrants represent, it's also important to remember the history. There are a lot of non-white people here a long time ago contributing with their sweat and their devotion and their contributions to this community a long, long time ago. And it's important that we remember the history as well as looking forward to the future. Thanks a lot.